It is the land of eternal battlefields and eternal wars. Today we're talking about Israel. Good evening, everyone, and welcome back to Geopolitics with Tyberius D. Unfortunately, I don't have a co-host today, but we can make it work. Sorry, I've got things going on. Today we're talking about Israel. I kind of need a bit of a co-host, but I'm sure chat can at least keep me a little bit on point here. At least I hope you guys can. But there's a lot going on right now that I really wanted to bust out, and I just haven't had the time. I'm actually a little late to the show, and all kinds of other things are happening. So I wanted to at least kind of like give some... I want to kind of give a general overview as far as like what's going on and why I'm gonna change up the show. Like, we're getting close to season 3, but there's a big issue with what's going on geopolitically in the world, and so you'll be getting a dispatch very soon. Maybe literally right after this, maybe even right before. But you will be doing a dispatch on the Second Cold War. So that's as far as what the updates are for the actual show. Let's get this started. So Israel is a very hot button issue for a lot of folks and very, very important for people, although I think a lot of it is a little silly, if I'm being completely honest. How do I put this? There's a lot of people that I think legitimately do care about Israel, and they should, and for many good reasons. But there's also a lot of people I think care about Israel, and it makes no sense whatsoever. So at least everyone largely knows what I'm talking about, even if you don't know exactly where Israel is on a map. Most people are pretty aware of how Israel affects basically the world stage, particularly in the Middle East. All right, so let's break this down. Let's just break out with the history and go from there. So Israel's history technically really starts in 1946, but I want to roll back even before that. Sorry, did I say 1946? 1949. Excuse me. Israel used to be known as Palestine, which used to be known as Judea, which used to be known as all kinds of other stuff. It's changed throughout the times, but the general level here is back during the era of Judea, is that it used to be pretty much the homeland of the Jewish people, and this is before Christendom really starts taking off. After that, you have the rise of Christendom, which kind of usurps this, which is why, Christianity is basically Judaism 2.0, and then eventually you'll get Islam, which is, at least if you ask them, is like religion 3.0 or in the Abrahamic religions. And they came to dominate most of the region, which obviously most of the people in the area are now, are followers of one of the Islamic faiths. Particularly, I believe Sunni is the biggest in this area. But as far as the general history here, this all really starts out with the principle called Zionism, and that was the idea that the Jewish people should have their own independent state. Something that pretty much any ethno-linguistic group says that they want. They just want their own. The problem is that the Jewish peoples had been spread across most of Europe. Most of them had either fled or were killed from the Holy Lands. There's a few enclaves here and there, but there was as many Jews as there was Christians and all other kinds of fake people in the basically the Levant, the Holy Land, Palestine, that would go into the modern era. And so they didn't really have any kind of major claim to it outside of like historical precedent. We'll get there here in a second, but there was Jews throughout pretty much most of Europe. you all have probably seen your history. They were persecuted in one way or another. Anti-Semitism got really bad. And then, of course, you have World War II and the Holocaust. And then, yeah, just goes along the lines of, general history. So let's roll this back to just around World War I, right? The Ottoman Empire is collapsing under its own weight. They can't police the areas that they have. The Turks are basically becoming, they're falling out of great power status and becoming a secondary power. And, what we see this with is basically the Brits and a few other people want to roll in, mainly the Brits and the French. The Brits will actually take control of Palestine, Transjordan, and Iraq after the end of the war. But what was really relevant here is two things. One is Sykes-Picot, which is basically the lines in the sand that the British and the French largely agree upon to what is going to be the post-war boundaries. And the other one is the Balfour Declaration, which largely indicates that the Westerners, particularly Britain, largely supports the independence of a Jewish state. And it would be in actually Palestine, honoring basically time-long commitments, or I'm sorry, like a time-old claim. I don't know, honestly, it's a little ridiculous, but it was a thing. And we actually start to see Jews start rolling into this area at that time in some kind of numbers because of Zionism. They basically claimed that Judea or Palestine was the Holy Land, and they would return. And even before World War II and the persecution of the Nazis and all these other folks, that starts taking off. It's not a lot, but it's quite a bit. And then, of course, you get into the 1930s with Kristallnacht and the oppression and pretty much the systematic wholesale slaughter of Jewish peoples throughout the continent. And just as a general well-being check is that what falls out apart is that we have the Holocaust. We have around 6 million Jews officially dead. It might be higher, might be a little bit lower. As there's some record keeping that's a little bit iffy. I mean, you don't get to really, you don't really know how many people actually were just pulled out on the side of a road and had a bullet put in the back of their head. We do know that there's numerous instances of that. There's a ravine in Ukraine where like 15,000 Jews were killed outside of Kiev. There's just a long list of these kind of things, and it's just kind of one of the black marks of human history that we just had to deal with. I'm sorry if I'm a little choked up. This is not exactly the easiest thing to talk about because we're talking about the wholesale extermination of a people based on who they are. And it's just... Anyway. So, this happens, and basically after the end of the war, the Allies saw what had happened, and they decided to basically make the Balfour Declaration they made the Balfour Declaration basically legal principle, and they thoroughly encouraged anyone or any of the Jewish faith that if they wanted to return to the Holy Land, they would help them. And in 1946, that's what happens. They start flooding into Palestine in massive numbers. They're literally walking off the boat and trying to build out their own home. And this will continue for a couple years. There's different ways here, but if I got my dates right, I might have it off by a year or two. Is that in 1949, most of the former British colonies are all given their independence. We're talking Egypt, Jordan, Palestine, Israel, Iraq, and then I don't remember if Syria and Lebanon, which were former French colonies, get this at the same time. But literally, the day of, and I believe it's May 1st, 1949, everyone gets their formal independence, and what happens is war's declared that day. All these former nation states, their first day in existence, and all of them tag team up to destroy Israel. It's quite a show. But the long and the short here is that even though the Israelis are outgunned and outmanned, and they literally are having their own newborn nation through Western assistance, particularly from the French, some of the British, and even a little bit from the Americans, they will be able to fight off and win this battle, and they'll be able to secure their own state. And this largely is all done within, I think, 6 months. I apologize if I don't have this exactly right, but it's relative. Most of the wars that Israel fights is relatively short. It's not multi-year spanning conflicts because the Israelis are really, really good at fighting. And we'll see this attrition up as we get into the 6-Day War and Yom Kippur and all those other things. So that happens, and Israel basically earns its right militarily to be a geopolitical entity. It earns its right to be a state. And now Palestine is basically screwed over. They get left with the West Bank, and they get left with Gaza, and they don't have, I think, half of their territory that they were supposed to get after independence was largely taken from them by Israel as part of the new treaty lines. I might be a little wrong on that one. That might come later with like the 6-Day War and whatnot. But anyway, obviously tensions are high. There is basically a general disdain for Israel throughout everyone in the region, and their history. And I'm just going to condense this down because it's literally just a retroactive, continuous engagement over and over and over again between the Arabs and the Israelis. Is that the Arabs say that you don't have a right to exist, and the Israelis either have to defend or they go on the offensive to basically guarantee their security. I'm trying to say this without actually taking sides in that because there's just no winning side. I'll just drop all my cards on the table so I don't have to even hype this too much. There's no winning side here. I don't really like the idea of the idea of Israel had a claim here. I think it was a bit ridiculous, but once they're there, and they had to figure out what they were going to do, and they built their own state, and they're basically just trying to protect themselves and defend themselves. But on the other hand, they will basically win, and in the actions of winning, pretty much every engagement that they will have to take the lives and the well-being of Arabs into their hands, and they will not treat them very well either. And so the general level here is that you kind of have what is functionally a religious ethno-state that is Israel, and it is not, up until very more recently, it has largely been seen as an abomination, that it does not deserve the right to exist or to prosper. And the Israelis had to defend it by arms. So this is the roundabout way of saying I don't really like anybody in this conversation. I do understand the motives of everyone there. The Israelis are saying, hey, look, this is our home. We're going to defend it. And you have Palestine, which pretty much has the exact same argument. Thing is, somebody did win. And, I mean, that's basically, this might go down to your ethical conversations of does might make right. And if you disagree with that, that's fine. But it's just sooner or later, the battles end, peace treaties have to be signed, and whoever's in control is in control. And so you'll have numerous engagements. You'll have the 6-Day War in 1967, which is literally the Israelis figure that they're about to get attacked, and their intelligence apparatus tells them they're going to get attacked, so they just go preemptive. And they basically use round-the-clock airstrikes with the entire Israeli Air Force, and they just go attack everybody. They systematically destroy Egypt first. They'll go over to Transjordan real quick, and then they'll finish off with Syria. And within 6 days, they will militarily defeat the coalition that was building up to oppose them. And there's plenty of evidence to suggest that they were going to be attacked. We do have diplomatic cables. We do have, general troop memos and documents. They were probably going to attack. I don't think there was a definitive launch date that the Arabs were going to attack. But just to give you even out the scale, we have just a couple years later we have Yom Kippur, and I believe this is 1973, where the Arabs do coalition, and they do coalition to attack Israel, and they instigate it on a Israeli holiday, which is Yom Kippur. The Israelis will get reeled at on the first phase, but they'll be able to kind of regroup and counterattack, and they'll win that confrontation too. I could go into the details. This is like the first time that the Arabs use anti-tank guided missiles. It's the very first generation of the Russian ones, and they're actually able to put quite a dent into the Israeli armored core, which is kind of a bit of a pride for the Israelis because they're very, very competent. Very much like their air forces, their ground forces, particularly their tankers, are very, very capable. And if anyone wants to know why, this is a desert, and tanks love a desert. It's the best playground for tanks anywhere and everywhere. So the general level here is that the Israeli tankers were very competent, and this is the first time they've really had to deal with a serious threat because they could basically outcrew and outshoot anyone else's tanks. The Israelis will eventually win the day here through combined arms operations and basically just being better soldiers and better combatants. This will lead into a number of conflicts here, there, and everywhere from Lebanon, Syria, Jordan. There's border skirmishes from here on there. We have the Intifadas, which we'll see in the 90s, which is you'll see rounds of insurgency instigated out of Gaza and the West Bank, which is more or less I don't know how to put this in any kind of real kosher way. It largely is the political stirring up and the outright insurrection of Palestinian Arabs within Israel and supported out of networks from Gaza and the West Bank. The goal is largely to tear Israel apart. They will fail, but they do a significant amount of personal property damage, and there's quite a few people killed. Largely where we're at now, and I'm kind of skipping over this, while this could be a very long history episode very, very easily. I'm skipping over a lot of it because it's just extremely touchy, and I don't want to just, make my entire audience mad. But the general level here is that Israel's pretty much won all of the conflicts that they could have. Whether the peace treaties are honored or not is kind of up in the air, as there's really not any kind of major peace treaties signed. It's all ceasefires and, hold them, stop them, that kind of thing. And the Israelis are slowly building out a bigger and bigger state by basically dishonoring what the primary treaty, which I can't remember which one it is, which is honoring what the Gaza Strip is and the West Bank is supposed to be official Palestinian territory. But you have, if you've seen it in the news, the Israeli settlements, and they've largely taken, I think it's anywhere between a third and half of what the Palestinian territories are supposed to be, Israel now effectively controls. And so sooner or later, at the current rate we're going to see the end of Palestine writ large. It will be formally annexed completely by the state of Israel, and even if they don't even admit it, we're heading that way. As far as just who I side with in this matter, it's not that I particularly like anybody. I'm going to make that very, very clear. I think everyone has some kind of legitimate claim here to self-defense and personal autonomy, but unfortunately, if you disagree with who's supposed to be in charge, sometimes it just results in a fight. And sooner or later in a fight, somebody wins, and Israel has won. So where we're at now is that Israel's in a really interesting spot. They, of their former enemies, they've either made peace agreements with or actually are now in some level of cooperation with pretty much everyone who opposed them. I'll just go around the corner real quick. Egypt largely was kind of pacified with the Egyptian-Israeli relations with Camp David back in the late 70s. This is Carter and all that. It was a very lukewarm relationship, but they've not, as far as I'm aware, they've not engaged in a direct military confrontation at all since, and they've largely just kind of ignored each other to a large degree. If I remember right, the stipulations of Camp David is that Israel had to get back the Sinai Peninsula, which was a very, very important strategic piece that Israel had to give up. And so doing so kind of made the Egyptians just kind of walk it off to a large degree. They've put aside their differences for the moment. Going directly south, you pretty much get into what is Saudi Arabia, which, granted, doesn't technically border, but it is very close. And actually, from everything that I'm seeing right now, they might as well have an official alliance. Israel is training Saudi troops, it's largely behind the scenes. They're not openly saying this, but the Israelis are largely giving personal assistance to the Saudis and military training because it's all both nations are built hardly with American made or weaponry, so they all like all the same components and all want to work, and so they can train them on the same general weaponry platforms. I am sorry, I'm a little skitsy a little today. I'm having a little trouble just keeping my general trend here. You guys have probably noticed the ums and the stop breaks and whatnot. So, Saudi Arabia and Israel are largely getting along. They actually have an oil sharing deal, as far as I'm aware of right now, which has gotten official, or at least is large, or everyone knows about it too, at least. But the general level is that they've just had it kind of put aside their differences, and they're actually working together, particularly against their common enemy, that is Iran. So, hey, the friend of my friend, or the enemy of my, what is it? Excuse me. The enemy of my enemy is my friend. There we go. Look how much of a mess today. I'm so sorry. Let's keep bringing this full circle. Jordan just has been systematically defeated in every engagement they have, and Jordan doesn't really have any friends. Most of their primary backer was the Soviet Union, as far as weaponry and platforms, and quite honestly, they were a geopolitical meat shield for the Israelis. With the Soviets gone and no one in the region really caring to support them, Jordan's just largely there as an afterthought. I'm actually expecting that if the superpowers ignore the Middle East, like I was expecting, that Transjordan won't exist here before too terribly long. But we're going to cover that and more in the dispatch here coming up. So that leaves Syria. Syria's had a number of exchanges, and they're the only people that really have consistently had an ongoing engagement with the Israelis. There's usually artillery duels over the Syrian or the Golan Heights every now and again. However, that largely has kind of been secondaried after most of that has been tabled with the most of that has been tabled with the Syrian Civil War. I'm sorry that I completely lost my train of thought there. The Syria basically split into a three-way civil war. One is the official government of Syria. One is the Syrian rebels, and obviously we have the Kurds. And to make this go full circle is that Israel doesn't really have to worry about it. And as far as I'm aware, they're not openly supporting any side in that, although I think they do prefer the Syrian rebels that are more pro-democratic. They definitely do not like Assad. And then finally we get to Lebanon. Lebanon was invaded back in 2008 by the Israelis. They pushed up to certain defensive points that they could just to kind of screw with Hezbollah because they were having missiles thrown at them. Lebanon has been in and out of trouble ever since. They had a civil war a ways back that ended, and they tried to put everything together. And if you guys remember the Beirut explosion last year, what happened was that every little piece that they've gained pretty much just went up in smoke with that explosion. And there's a lot of people calling that there's probably going to be another civil war in Lebanon, which is very unfortunate because there's been a lot of death, destruction, and chaos already in the country. And they had just started to really get something going for them, and now it's all gone. So my heart bleeds a little bit for Lebanon because they actually were trying to get their act together right, and for all of the hoopla and whatever, they were doing a lot better than they had been. And so I'm very saddened to see what the state that they're in now. It's very unfortunate, and I hope they can somehow put it all back together again, but I'm not hopeful in that. I think that pretty much covers the history, so we'll move into just given geographic lens here. Yeah, look at me stutter. The geography is pretty simple. There's no strategic depth to Israel, and it's a semi-arid desert, if not just blatantly arid. It's not as bad as Saudi Arabia, where there's just no rain, but there's very little. It's largely relegated to some levels of rain that comes, I believe, in the winter. It's part of mountain runoff and just general climatological trends that come off the Mediterranean. But as far as like where we are on a general purpose and point, is that Israel is only like 30 miles wide at the most wide, and I think that's in that southern portion, which is largely desert and no one lives there. There's the closest point, if I remember correctly, between like the official border of the West Bank and where the Mediterranean Sea is. At its thinnest point, it's only 8 miles. So it's very, very small. It doesn't have any kind of strategic depth. Now, I am talking more about the general region as part of this. And so as far as like what I'm getting at here, excuse me, as far as where I'm going with this is that the general region is not the best. Geographically, it's kind of this nexus point between Africa, Asia, and Europe, although obviously Europe's more up around Istanbul and whatnot, is that there's a reason that this place has had so many battles. Israel alone has been hosted, not just in modern history, but in history throughout the world, is hosted probably more battles than any other specific region of its size. And the Levant is absolutely outnumbers as a collective whole, the Levant outnumbers anywhere else by a factor of like 5. It's ridiculous. The general level here is that this is basically the land intersection of 3 continents, more or less. And because of that, if there is a geopolitical struggle, it largely will eventually get here, and it will be a major conversation to where, I mean, it's a geopolitical struggle. Battles happen here. This goes all the way back from the Egyptians and the Samnites to this goes back to the Egyptians and the Samnites, or not the Samnites. Why did I say that? The Hittites. Blech. This is literally back with Ramses II, and this is during the Bronze Age, right? This is the 1300s BC, and you have battles fought in this region between these two powers. You'll have Assyria that will come in, and they'll do battle here. You'll have I don't remember if Babylon gets here. I think they fight 1 or 2 here, but I cannot recollect. You'll have Alexander of Macedon. You'll have I skipped a part here. You'll have the Persian Empire. They'll come through here. You'll have Alexander. You'll have the Seleucids that follow suit with the Ptolemies in Egypt. The Seleucids that are the kind of like the Persian successor state. You'll have eventually Rome, or you'll have Judea for a minute, but you'll have Rome show up. And they'll control the area. And it's literally just a long one history of empires coming in and out and dominating the region. You'll have the Sassanids. You'll have the Caliphates. You'll have them. Did the Mongols get here? I don't think they get this far. No, they don't. Excuse me. You will have the Caliphates. You'll have Tamerlane. You'll have the Ottomans. You'll have the British. Literally anyone with a boat eventually will be able to get here. And of course, even this modern day, is that even though the Americans don't have a formal presence here, is that their weapons and their military hardware does get here. So this is the battleground of the edges. This is the forever war. So I do want to thank everyone in the Twitch chat for being here. I appreciate you all here. You're blowing up the chat. If you're in YouTube, you can see that on on the side. I will try to answer questions as I can, but that's going to be more of the after show. But I will put it this way: there is one part that I did want to hit that you guys asked me to, and is like, could you go over Israel-Turkey relations? They're weird right now. And I do want to kind of bring this full circle with that, because I did not talk about the Turks. And I could probably talk about them more with the Persians too. Israel and Turkey kind of look at each other a little weird. They don't have any particular quarrel with each other, because anything the Turks want to have to deal with is not part of the Israeli purview, and anything that the Israelis have to deal with is not really part of the Turkic purview. The only like geopolitical clash that they actually have at all is basically over Syria, and they largely agree that Syria sucks and should be destroyed. So, if anything, they have a little bit of reason to just kind of play sides with each other. The politics do not reflect that, though. Erdogan is very much. I've said this before, and I really mean it. Erdogan's kind of like this neo-Ottoman sycophant. I don't know how to put this. He basically just kind of wants to turn the Turks into what we used to see the Ottoman Empire was before World War I brought its collapse. Whether that's good or bad is your own personal opinion, but that's not a state that actually looks at Israel fondly. A more secular Turkey could, but one that's actually more religiously prone, not so much. So that's very that's very loaded, right? Which chat's talking about Muslim or Jewish relations, and yeah, they're not good. We don't have to iterate that over and over again. We all know that's not good. And a more religious Turkey does not look at Israel in a kind light. So they're kind of frozen. Not going to say there's not room to actually geopolitically work together here on common interests, but to a large degree, there's just not a lot of common interests. And Israel's kind of in bed with the Saudis. So what the long way of putting this here is that if Israel's largely going to be left alone between the Turks and Israel, at least from what I'm looking at. But if the Turks either side against the Persians or side against the Saudis, that means that Israel has a reason to talk to the Turks. If they side against the Persians, which is basically the people that say Israel should be nuked off the face of the freaking planet, they will look at the Turks kind of fondly, and they might even agree to bomb them together. I don't know. On the other side of this is that if you look at the other way, is that the Israelis are cooperating with the Saudis, and if the Turks don't like what the Saudis are doing, that can bring those two into direct confrontation. I think that the Israelis are smart enough that they're largely going to let the Saudis do the heavy lifting there and just kind of be the front man for the job, but that doesn't mean that the Turks are dumb enough to ignore them. And so, at least in that general level, this could go 1,000 different directions very, very quickly, but I largely suspect that no matter what Turkey really wants, they're not going to really be in a situation where they are looking to engage. Let's get to the last one. That's Iran, right? The relations between Israel and Iran are absolutely destructive. Obviously, everyone knows why. Iran's been basically calling for the death of Israel for ages, and have openly said that if they ever got nuclear weapons, they would nuke them off the face of the earth. Completely understandable, I guess, in the regards of religious fervor, and basically Iran fully supports the idea that Palestine should be for Palestinians. The conversation's largely over at this point, and Iran's having to deal with Iraq and Syria and all these other things that are going on, and their particular mutual enemy that is Saudi Arabia. So, largely, I don't expect that relationship to change in any way, shape, or form. It's bad. It doesn't look to get any better, but it is shaping up into where it actually does matter now, because if Iran and the Saudis don't get along anymore, or they actually get into a mutual confrontation, Israel might have to pick sides. And of course, they already picked a side, but they might actually have to get physically involved, because Iran versus Saudi Arabia, there's problems on both sides, but Iran can probably put up a better fight. And so that will be very interesting to see where that would go. So I've done I've done the geography, I've done the past. Now, usually we would do the future. However, most of my predictions have gone to hell lately. We're going to be talking about that in the next dispatch coming up. And so the general threat assessment here is that Israel has a lot of options. And if they really want to play it smart, all they have to do is really kind of sit and just build out and deal with their Palestinian issue. I hate to phrase that in that way, but it's just one of those deals where it's kind of an over conversation at this point. I'm just waiting for Palestine to be wiped off the face of the earth. Unless somebody comes in and makes a peace agreement in the 11th hour, it's just not going to happen. So outside of that, until the next geopolitical major struggle comes in that engages that engages Israel, I don't see them being a major card to play. It'll be very interesting in the next Cold War where that's going to go, but the long and the short, at least from what I am personally looking at, is that they can sit pretty. Doesn't mean that they will, but largely that's what they're looking at for the next 10 years and maybe even the next 15. So there's my little bit of the future bit. I'll happily redress this if I see something come up. Yes, if Saudi Arabia starts punching with somebody, that could be a thing. If Turkey decides to get more aggressive, that could be a thing. There's a lot of options here. Way too many to count. And so as Cold War II Electric Boogaloo starts ramping up, we'll definitely be looking for how this all shakes out. And I'll be providing content for you guys to let you know what's going on and where. So, without further ado, I've been Tyberius D. Thank you all for joining us. If you have any quick questions, feel free to hit us up real quick in the chat. Otherwise, feel free to hit it here down below if you're watching YouTube. And if you're on the podcast, feel free to contact me on Facebook, LinkedIn, and Twitter. That's the easiest ways to get a hold of me. Geopolitics with Tyberius D is brought to you by the wonderful people that are part of our Patreon community. That is Andrew Wagner, the West Dude, and Julia. We appreciate all the help that you guys do for us. Let's see. Do we have anything left on the... excuse me. I don't see chat really throwing us up on anything, so... yeah, if you guys have anything left, feel free. I do thank all of you for watching. I do notice that our viewership is going up and down a little bit. I think we're hitting a bit of a wall here as far as viewership is concerned. We changed up the Twitch viewership, which is helping a little bit as far as the recording time. As far as YouTube, it's really hit and miss. It seems to be that I need to get my hashtags a little bit better. And we're probably just going to have to wait for an event to happen. I probably should have done a thing on Suez. But yeah, if you want to help us out, I'd appreciate it. Thank you very much for listening to us. Really, it's always interesting to see. We've got a lot of content coming up, but we're pretty much done with Nations for a quick minute. It's going to be very interesting to see where we go. Just as a quick reminder as far as what we have coming up. Let's see. This should address what I've got. We're going to be looking at party systems on the next episode, followed by trade, followed by demographics, and then we're going to largely redress with Britain. So that's the outlook to come. I appreciate you all for being a part of this, and we'll catch you next time. Have a good one, guys.